The morning comes softly, almost unwillingly. No laughter, no voice, only the cry of a distant crow and the sound of the wind pressing against the wooden shutters. Inside the cottage, the air is cold and still. The ashes in the hearth have lost their glow, pale and lifeless, like the warmth that once filled this home. She sits on the edge of her narrow bed, her fingers tracing the fabric of her old wool blanket. The boards beneath her feet creak faintly, a sound that once would have made him stir, half asleep, mumbling her name. But there is no answer now, only silence, that heavy, aching silence that fills every space where love used to live. She looks toward the small window. The world outside glows faintly in the early light, but she does not move to open the shutters. Not yet. She is not ready to let the day in. The morning feels like a weight pressing on her chest, a reminder that time moves forward even when the heart refuses to follow. Her home is small, a single room built of timber and clay, with the smell of damp earth lingering in the corners. It once felt full, filled with the rhythm of two lives moving together, the scrape of his boots across the floor, the laughter that echoed when he came in from the fields, face roughened by wind and sun. Now, every corner whispers his name. His coat still hangs beside the door, stiff and worn, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and sweat. His boots rest where he left them, one slightly turned as if he might return to slip them on. On the table, two wooden bowls remain from last night's meal. She hasn't had the strength to put one away. She stands for a long while, her hand resting on the back of his chair. The wood feels cool under her fingers, but it's enough to draw a memory of his rough hand covering hers as they said grace before supper. The air feels thinner now, emptier. Even the sunlight filtering through the cracks seems different, sharp, colorless, a light that doesn't warm. Outside, life goes on. Through the small window, she sees smoke curling from her neighbor's chimney, hears the distant bark of a dog, the sound of a cart's wooden wheels rolling over frost-hardened dirt. In the 1600s, a widow did not blend into the crowd. She was seen, marked by her clothing, her solitude, and by the quiet gossip that followed wherever she went. Some offered pity, their glances soft but distant. Others crossed to the other side of the lane, pretending not to notice her at all. A woman without a husband was a woman without standing. No voice in the council, no claim to land, no shield from hunger or rumor. And rumors, in a small village, were as constant as the wind. She feels their eyes when she steps outside. The bucket she carries to the well feels heavier than it should. Every movement feels watched. Some whisper, "Poor soul." Others murmur darker things under their breath, "Cursed, alone for a reason." She doesn't answer. She never does. She keeps her gaze low, her steps steady. The world will not see her break. Grief does not stop the chores. There is bread to knead, linen to mend, a small patch of garden to tend. Her body moves through the motions, each task practiced, familiar, yet each one feels hollow now. When she grinds grain by hand, she remembers how he once carried the sacks inside, laughing at her stubbornness to do it herself. When she stokes the hearth, she hears his voice. "A little more wood, love. Keep the fire proud." Now the fire burns small, careful, because the wood pile is low and there is no one left to fetch more. Between tasks, the silence stretches. It is not just quiet. It's the kind of silence that hums in your bones, that makes you aware of every heartbeat. Sometimes she speaks aloud, small things, simple things, just to hear her own voice again. But the sound fades quickly, swallowed by the empty room. As the pale sun reaches higher, she dresses for the day. A gown of heavy black wool, plain, coarse, and unadorned. Every widow knew what it meant to wear black in those days. It was not fashion, it was confession. A public declaration of grief, a sign to the world that her heart was buried beneath the soil with her husband. The fabric scratches against her skin, but she bears it, as if the discomfort is part of the ritual. Her hair, once braided with care, is now tucked beneath a modest white linen cap. The woman in the small mirror, a polished shard of metal hung by the window, looks older than she remembers. Her eyes seem darker, deeper, not just from tears, but from everything that must now be carried alone. This clothing is both armor and prison. It keeps the world's pity at bay, but it also traps her inside her sorrow. When she finally steps out into the cold morning, the black cloth absorbs the light, and still she walks forward. Because even in the 1600s, even in a world that looked upon widows with suspicion and sorrow, life had to go on. She carries her grief the way she carries her bucket, heavy but balanced. And though her heart aches, she moves with quiet strength. The fire in the hearth may be gone, but something inside her still burns.
The days blurred together, one long thread of gray light and aching hands. In the cold hush of morning, before the church bell tolled, the widow would rise. The small hearth would be nothing but cold ash, the scent of smoke lingering like a memory. She'd wrap her thin shawl tighter, fingers stiff from the chill, and step into the muted silence of her little cottage. There was no husband now to split the wood or tend the fields, no warm voice to share the burden of the dawn. The bread she ate was coarse, the crust hard, yet she chewed it with quiet defiance, because it was earned by her own hands. The weight of work. Each day began with labor, not grand or noble, but humble, repetitive, endless. She spun flax on her wheel until her fingertips burned, twisting thread with a rhythm that filled the room. Whir, pull, twist, whir, pull, twist. The sound was both a lullaby and a chain. It reminded her that time still moved, even when she felt forgotten. When her thread was done, she would take in mending from neighboring households. Wealthy women who pitied her just enough to hand her worn linens or frayed garments. They'd leave them at her door, rarely entering, as though her grief were a contagion. Yet when she worked, her touch was steady and graceful. Each stitch held purpose, almost prayerful. She sewed not only to mend cloth, but to hold together what little remained of her world. Once a week, she walked to the small village square with a woven basket. Inside were the fruits of her labor, a few spools of thread, a loaf of coarse barley bread, or a bundle of herbs she had grown behind her cottage. Her boots were thin, the earth bit through them. The market was alive with noise, laughter, gossip, barter. Yet around her, a hush always followed. Conversations dimmed, eyes turned away. A widow in the 1600s was a shadow in daylight, visible but untouchable. Some whispered she carried misfortune, others muttered of witchcraft when the wind bent toward her. There were stories, cruel and absurd, that a widow's tears could spoil milk, that her presence at a well could sour the water, but she never spoke back. Instead, she set down her basket, her eyes lowered, her face composed in quiet endurance. When someone offered her a coin or a trade, she nodded, thanked them softly, and returned home. Her dignity intact, even if her belly would go half empty. Hunger and Grace Hunger became her constant companion, sitting beside her at every meal. Sometimes she went days on nothing but boiled roots and hard bread softened in water. Yet she never begged. Even when her hands trembled, even when her vision blurred from exhaustion, she refused to kneel before pity. There was a grace in her suffering, not the holy kind praised from pulpits, but something raw and real. It was the grace of survival of a woman who endured because no one else would do it for her. In the evening, she would light a candle, not for prayer, but for company. Its flickering glow painted shadows on the walls, and in that trembling light she imagined faces, her husband, her mother, the neighbors long gone. For a few breaths she wasn't alone. Some villagers offered kindness in quiet ways, a slice of cheese left on her doorstep, a kind word at the well. They saw in her not a curse, but courage. Yet others mocked or avoided her, fearful of the widow's curse that old tales whispered about. When cattle fell ill or a storm struck the fields, eyes turned to her door as if sorrow made her dangerous. Once, a child from the village asked her, "Do you miss him?" The question pierced her like a blade. She smiled faintly, placed her hand on the child's cheek, and whispered, "Every day, but I've learned to miss him while I work." And then she returned to spinning, the wheel humming softly, a sound stronger than any sermon. Each thread she spun, each loaf she baked was more than labor. It was language. Her hand spoke when her mouth could not. They told the story of a woman left behind by society, yet still moving forward, inch by inch, stitch by stitch. When she kneaded bread, she pressed her sorrow into the dough, shaping it into sustenance. When she washed linen by the frozen stream, she felt the sting of the water cleanse not just fabric but memory. The village might have seen a widow, silent, tired, alone, but she was something greater. She was the unspoken heartbeat of the age, the women who held life together while the world looked away. As night fell again, she sat by her window, her hands still busy, her face lit by the faint moonlight. The world might never tell her story, but her hands did. Every movement, every breath, every act of work, a quiet hymn of endurance in a world that barely noticed she lived. The world did not end when her husband died. It simply grew quieter, colder, and more watchful. Every step she took through the village now echoed in whispers. Once, she had been the miller's wife, a woman of place and purpose. Now, she was the widow, a title that clung to her like ash, one that carried neither respect nor mercy. In the eyes of the 17th century world, grief was not only a burden, but a warning. A woman without a man was a woman without protection. And in a time where superstition bled into faith, that made her dangerous. The church bell tolled every Sunday, its sound cutting through mist and chimney smoke. She still attended, sitting in the last pew where no one needed to meet her eyes. When the priest spoke of sin, her heart beat faster, not because she believed herself wicked, but because she saw how easily the crowd turned to glance at her when he said words like temptation or disobedience. They did not see her as holy or helpless. They saw a question, a puzzle God had left behind, and humanity fears what it does not understand. Inside those stone walls, she found strange comfort. The scent of candle wax and myrrh reminded her of her wedding mass long ago, of vows made beneath the same vaulted ceiling before life became a long fast from joy. She would kneel and whisper prayers not for herself, but for the husband whose name was still carved into her heart, for the child she never bore, for the soul she feared might wander unblessed. But the church, like the village, was a mirror. It reflected what society already believed, that a woman alone was either to be pitied, pious, or punished. The curate offered charity sometimes, bread, a candle, an old shawl, but his eyes lingered too long. He spoke to her with the gentleness of a man rehearsing virtue, his kindness always edged with curiosity. He asked if she prayed enough, if she kept her thoughts pure, as though her loneliness itself were a temptation to sin. And though she nodded politely, inside her chest she felt the slow, steady pulse of quiet rebellion. A woman can be good, she thought, and still long for warmth. The worst cruelty came not from the church or hunger, but from the mouths of neighbors. When a cow miscarried, when bread failed to rise, when a storm tore the thatch from a roof, the whispers began. She walks alone at night. She speaks to the wind. She was seen lighting a candle after curfew. To the frightened, this was proof enough. To the jealous, it was satisfaction. In a century where belief was thicker than reason, widow's grief could easily be mistaken for witchcraft. One night, they came to her door, not with torches or furies, but with fear. A few men, drunk from the tavern, demanded she bless the crops, mocking her softly, daring her to prove she was no witch. She stood still in the doorway, face pale, eyes steady, and she said only, "If I had power, sir, none of us would go hungry." The words hung in the night air like frost. They laughed uneasily, then left. But in the morning, she found her washing torn from the line and footprints in the mud. In those dark days, when shame and silence were her only company, faith became something different. It was no longer the church's version. It was her own, stripped bare of sermons and fear. Each evening she lit a single candle on her table, not for superstition, not for ritual, but for memory. The flame was her conversation with the unseen, with her husband, with God, with whatever part of the world still had room for her voice. Sometimes she prayed aloud, and the room seemed to breathe with her, walls flickering in gold light, shadows listening. Other nights she said nothing at all. Silence became her prayer. Though the village had stripped her of place and pride, they could not take her rituals, the little rebellions that kept her human. She still kept her husband's tools polished, though they hung unused in the corner of the cottage. She washed his work shirt once a month, folding it neatly as if he might return. In winter, she sprinkled salt by the door to ward off cold, a habit he had once teased her for. And when the wind howled at night, she whispered his name, not as a prayer, but as a defiance of forgetting. One morning, as she walked past the mill where he once worked, the new miller, younger, stronger, looked up and said, "You should sell his hammer. You've no use for it." She only smiled faintly and replied, "It still belongs to the man who earned it." That night, she held the hammer close as she sat by the hearth, feeling the worn handle warm against her palms, a reminder that not everything can be taken, not even by time. Rumor seasons turned. The whispers faded, as they always do when the next tragedy arrives to distract the cruel. But she remained, steady as the stone her cottage stood on. Children who once feared her grew curious, and she began to share stories with them, tales of ships, storms, and saints who had lost everything yet still rose again. Her voice softened, her laughter returned in small, cautious breaths. The church still saw her as an oddity, The market still measured her worth in coins and pity, but she had learned something precious. When the world takes your place, you make your own ground to stand upon. And in that small cottage on the edge of the village, lit by one stubborn candle, a woman who had once been forgotten became her own quiet kind of legend, not for miracles, but for surviving every lie and living still. The night settles softly over the village, the kind of silence only known after long storms. Inside her small cottage, the widow sits near the hearth, not in grief, but in calm remembrance. The fire she rekindles crackles gently, its glow warming the shadows that once felt endless. Her thoughts drift through the years, the love lost, the cold morning survived, the whispers endured. Yet now, those sorrows no longer sting. They have shaped her into something unbreakable. Her hands, once trembling with fear, now move with quiet certainty as she mends, tends, and keeps life alive. She does not need the world's approval anymore. Her worth is measured in endurance, in the bread she bakes, the children she helps, the light she keeps burning when others have turned away. As the fire burns steady through the night, her face softens in the glow. There is no grand triumph, no applause, only peace, the kind earned by those who have carried their pain and turned it into strength. The widow exhales, watching the smoke curl upward, a prayer, a memory, a promise. Tomorrow will come, and so will she.